So here we are on the evening of the 10th of August, 2022, looking at the 7 points of mind training, the Lojong trainings, specifically the 5th point, the extent of proficiency in the trainings. And we've already spoken of all instructions have one aim, as I talked about a little bit earlier, that we identify less and less with the cravings and aversions and ownership and I, me, mine, and more with what we find in the space between the breaths or the space between the thoughts. Which includes, I think, although it often isn't written about, an aspect of joy. So that's really a part they sort of blend together in a way. The second one in this little group is 2 testimonies, rely on the important one. As we begin to see ourselves increasingly clearly, neither artificially pumping ourselves up with arrogance or artificially slashing ourselves down with disparaging thoughts and comments. And interestingly, these two things often go together. Not always, but fairly often. We begin to count more and more on our own assessment of how we are and where we're doing. Again, being aware of and at times grateful for the perceptions of others, but ultimately relying on ourselves there. A joyous state of mind is a constant support. We talked about that last time. The cultivation of a joyous mind, but also, if your mind is always grumpy or non-joyous in some other way, it's an indication that perhaps your practice could be more helpful to you than it is being. And it might be worth looking at the meditation instructions again, at the compassion practice of the exchange of self and others, the Tom Glenn practice. Also, even the preliminary practices, really thinking and looking about causes and conditions. When I see something arising that I have an adverse reaction to, does that come up in my mind? Oh, there are causes and conditions for that. It didn't just happen. Then the question arose last week also, wait a second. There is the joy that's in distinction to sorrow. The joys that arise with pleasant occurrences and seem to disappear when the pleasant occurrences aren't there or something really negative arises. And joy is spoken of by many teachers, a different aspect of it. There's the relative joy, and then there's this more absolute joy, the joy that is already present when the clouds begin to clear a bit, and the obstructions we have to being present to our own awakened mind, our own Buddha mind, our own clear light mind, as they begin to dissipate. There is a joy in that, regardless of what might be happening in the samsaric world of ebb and flow and giving and taking and coming and going and so forth. And the question arises, and as it was asked, when all hell is breaking loose, you really expect to have the support of a joyful mind. And the distinction, that joyful mind that is always present but not always visible is important, but not always available, is it? And if we are suddenly faced with a loss of someone very dear to us, for example, or an illness in ourselves, where does the support of a joyful mind come in there? If it could almost be used as a spiritual bypass. Oh, this is empty. I'm just going to be joyful. I'll keep my joyful mind, even though this very difficult thing has arisen. And if I can't do that, then I'm not a good practitioner. I hear that one from time to time also. Gee, this is happening, but I'm supposed to be maintaining my joyful mind. Must be I'm not practicing very well. But the practice, of course, starts off with mindfulness of what is actually present. And if what is actually present, for example, is grief, then of course, being present to grief, not pushing it away, accepting adversity as the path, rather than trying to get away from it or in some way manipulate it, is always a part of the practice. And grief and other similar things, they hurt. And to practice with, oh, that hurts, without adding fuel to the fire of making up stories and telling oneself how we're alone and all the stuff we can do with those kinds of things. Simply be present to this human experience is happening in this one right now. As it is and has been in so many others, of course, is part of that. To offer compassion to ourselves in such situations, and to bring in compassion for others that have experienced the same or similar kinds of things is part of the practice. That question keeps coming up. I use it all the time. How do I want to be in this moment? So when something abruptly arises that is painful, for example, how do I want to be in this moment? I want to be present. I want to be mindful of what's happening now. I want to experience my body and mind as they are as this comes. How else do I want to be in this moment? I want to be aware of others as well. I would like to be available and present in ways that might be helpful. I would like to be compassionate, even in my own grief, for example. And of course, we do this imperfectly. But the practice is always available and is, in a way, a joy in itself. It becomes increasingly so, I think, the more we do with it, the more we practice, the more it is in itself a joy. So that even when we're practicing with the adversity that arises, which is, what this The third point was, take adversity as the path. And this suggests doing that joyfully. It's neither ignoring the adversity nor succumbing to it. Being present to it and recognizing, yes, I can bring this practice to whatever arises. I'm so grateful that it's there. And this last point is sort of carries on from there. Proficiency means you do it even when distracted. And when are you most distracted is when all hell's breaking loose, right? I mean, that's when you're most distracted. All of a sudden you're in the midst of a flood. Or in so many parts of the world, all of a sudden the artillery fire is getting closer and closer to your town. Can we practice under such circumstances? I wanted to read a little bit from Traylor Cabgan, the Blue Book. You are proficient if you can practice even when distracted. This is what he says. After practicing Lojong meditation and Tonglen for some time, we'll gradually become familiar with positive mental attitudes, which will in turn start to become a habit rather than something we are trying to manufacture. This is true. I can speak to that and many, many, many others that have taken the time to practice these things for, quote, some time, and it doesn't say how long. Lo and behold, positive mental attitudes become increasingly a part of the way one operates in the world and do begin to become habits. Not all habits are bad, he continues. Lojong practices are also habit forming. So if we do them consistently, they will gradually become a part of our psychological makeup and personality traits. We think of our personality traits as, oh, that's who I am. Well, no, that's not who we are. Those are just as impermanent as anything else and just as changeable. We're not stuck with what we think of as our personality traits. We have our causes and conditions, and some of them are very, very strong and powerful, or at least they feel that way. But the practice is one of transformation, that the way we experience first and then deal with what arises in our lives, we can do it differently than we did before. And we can recognize our old habit patterns as, oh, there's my old habit energy coming up again. I think I got most of that from my mother's side of the family, and all the other crap came from my father's side of the family. I can see it all trickling down to me. It's all pretty clear. It's I came by it honestly, so to speak, and the parts that have come from the lives that we have lived, the culture we have been in, our friends and so forth, everyone that's influenced us in various ways, didn't just affect us. It really is a part of who we are, which also shifts and changes and dances. It isn't still, and it isn't a thing. So not all habits are bad. Where once we became distracted by moments of depression, bitterness, or hostility, we'll now, through mindfulness and awareness, become less self-obsessed and more cheerful. I'm thinking back to, reading this. I can remember a time I was kind of, yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if it's true. I kind of doubt it. It sounds almost like a bit of a fairy tale. If you have spent a lot of time in depression or bitterness or hostility, you just kind of think that's where I'm at. That's who I am. I'm a hostile person. And lo and behold, you begin to discover as you practice these things that no, that's not really at all true. Hostility arises sometimes. Sometimes it's not there at all. And if I'm paying more attention to the times it's not there at all, and I catch it when it arises, and say, oh, there's that hostility again, and kind of start to treat it lightly a little bit and not get so wrapped up in it, the habit energy shifts and begins to become more in that mode. And he continues, what does he say here? He quotes Jamgon Khantrul. He then quotes this book, from which everybody takes their stuff. Which says, a skilled horseman does not fall from his horse even when he is distracted. In the same way, if you're able to take adverse conditions that suddenly develop as aids to mind training, even without expressly directing your attention to do so, then you are proficient in mind training. If the guy on the horse or the woman on the horse, if the person on the horse has to think about what to do, they're going to fall off. It's reached the point that they're able to just ride it. And this is similar, they're saying. The two bodhicittas, the absolute spaciousness and the relative compassion, arise clearly and effortlessly along with everything that appears. Enemies, friends, troublemakers, even this one, happiness or suffering. The fact that our minds become naturally inclined toward mindfulness and awareness is an indication of how much we have changed as a result of our meditation practices. The phrase to practice even when distracted means that we're automatically practicing Lojong as we go about our business without even noticing that we're doing so. And there he goes right to the basic practice of mindfulness. And it's at the heart of all of this. The Sanskrit mindfulness word is smriti, which really means to remember. That's the root of the word. And we're remembering to be aware of what's arising. It's very different to have irritation or hostility or frustration arise in the mind and simply respond and react to it, than to notice, oh, hostility, irritation is arising in my mind. It's a game changer. It's a sudden shift. Suddenly you're going in a different direction. Just that. So a part of our ongoing practice, and I'm sure that each of us has experienced this of times when that mindfulness has arisen unbidden. Again, it's suddenly, oh, I am now feeling anxious. Not just that you're anxious and responding to it, but, oh, that's anxiety arising in me right now. How do I want to be in this moment? It just, once that awareness, that looking at ourselves in that way becomes increasingly present, increasingly automatic, as they were saying, this happens, it just shifts everything. And I just want to tell one little story about the support of a joyous mind. Fred Epsteiner, my teacher, tells of being in India in the early 70s and spending time very intimately and rather intensely in terms of his training with teachers that had left Tibet less than 15 years ago, 15 years before, as the Chinese took over. And their experience was of escaping in the night, basically, through dangerous mountain passages, at times being shot at, trying to make it to safety. And their shifts in their experience was of living in the climate that they were used to, of course, in Tibet, which is really different than it is in India, where all the heat and the climate change is so different. The language is different. The people that live there are different. And the high up lamas, particularly the Dalai Lama and the other lamas that were the leaders in their culture, it was a theocracy. So they were not only leaders of the religion, they were also leaders of the state. And they were treated very almost like royalty. The Dalai Lama lived in a palace. The higher up folks had, attendants, and they were often up on thrones and all this stuff. And now they were living in a couple of rooms with no attendants and nobody doing all this stuff. And from Fred's own observations, this was a really lighthearted, jovial group of people. And as best he could tell from hearing stories, they were that way right from the beginning of getting to India. And you talk about a situation where you might have reason to say, I have a right to my anger, I have a right to my sadness, I have a right to my fears, and my God, and maybe they did, but they didn't choose to cash in on that right. So it can be done by even large groups of people. Of course, these are people that grew up with this tradition, permeating the culture and society. So I will stop and I will turn off the recording.